Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's law is wrong, it learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. Tupac Shakur, the rose that grew from concrete. Welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. In honor of Black History Month, this episode we are beginning our discussion on Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. Today we will be focusing on an overview of the novel, discussing the characters, setting, major themes, and connections we've made.
So what you all heard was that poem that became now the title emblazoned on the cover of Angie Thomas's prequel to The Hate You Give. And just like Vanessa mentioned, this is all part of our way of honoring Black History Month. We had a read-in last week for it. And so I'm George Gomez, and your co-host and EPCC English professor, and also a board member for Las Americas. And I'll let my co-hosts introduce themselves too and their affiliations.
Well, okay, I guess I'll go first.
Always Vanessa.
So my name is Vanessa. I am a undergraduate at the University of Texas at El Paso. I'm studying literature.
Yeah, I call Vanessa the voice of the podcast. You heard her read that awesome poem at the intro of the show. My name is Richie Marufo. I'm an educator. I teach a variety of writing courses, sometimes with the college and just in the community. I'm involved with all sorts of literary events and projects via Border Senses, and I'm the project director of the Barbed Wire Open Mic Series, a place where people can come up, show up, sign up, and read their work. And of course, I love podcasts. I love helping produce quite a few, including Literally Literary. So I'm happy to be invited to this literary table. Concrete Rose, what's up? What's good with Concrete Rose?
There's a lot that's good with Concrete Rose. Those of you who have been with us from the beginning will remember that The Hate You Give was our second or third novel that we talked about in this podcast. And so we're really excited to be back with Angie and, her prequel. Those of you who haven't, read the Hate You Give, we, just like with any work, right, where there's a codependency there, we would highly recommend you all check it out first. You can also just maybe listen to our podcast episodes on it. One of the episodes we do talk about the film comparisons. If you're thinking about just, taking that shortcut and just watching the film, so you can kind of know what to expect and the differences there. And
nice plug.
Yeah.
Nice plug.
But yeah, what we all's, as usual, what were y'all's first impressions with Angie's work just in and of itself?
I really like her writing style. The way that she, I guess, you can really tell like who these characters are, like just the way that the narrator is describing them. Like they feel like real people to me. Even like the minor characters, like she really finds a way to like, who these people are, kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. I'm enamored with Angie Thomas's writing style. I think it's so fluid, and as you just alluded to, Vanessa, there's a realness to it that I think just translates so well to page. And as we've mentioned, it is a prequel, so coming in with the world that she built in The Hate You Give, I just felt like I was revisiting a lot of these neighborhoods and places that we've already read and seen if you watch the movie. In fact, even retroactively, as I was imagining, I was telling you guys before the show in our pre-discussion that, as I was reading this in my literary imagination, as I read it, I cast younger versions of the movie characters now in my head. So I think that really does well. And you bring up a good question in terms of teaching the book, and a question a lot of people might have, Jorge, is whether or not this could work as a standalone, especially teaching it. And so obviously, it's going to be enhanced by already having read the book. But if you're a teacher, you probably don't want to assign both of them. And so a good workaround, especially because I think students do react better to like multimedia, if you incorporate like them watching the film and then maybe pairing that up with, let's say, a podcast, like our podcast episode on it, that'd be pretty cool for the students to experience, and it probably wouldn't overwhelm them. And then I really like this book in particular for the students as a book to read. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that, you guys, and if it does work as a standalone. Too much?
No, yeah. I was just seeing if Vanessa wanted to jump in, but yeah, I just want to echo, everything you said. Is exactly what I would say. I think as we've been talking about in this podcast, we want to be conscious of pedagogical strategies, right, and teaching works in the classroom, and especially diversifying the canon, as they call it. Of course, we've talked a lot about the canon in this show, and there's of course pros and cons, and I don't think anyone is saying ban the canon, right? There was a big controversy about that, online, and a lot of people went so far as to send like death threats and slurs, for simply saying that, we should diversify the canon. But Angie Thomas is right up there for me as far as teachable books that students can get a lot out of. In this case, we have a book that is fresh off the press, unlike Hate You Give. So, this comes from Balls of Bray, which is from HarperCollins. And if y'all notice the spines, this is the spines. I don't know if y'all had noticed, but I was putting it there on the bookshelf, and that same kind of font, typeface, and spine design, goes into Hate You Give, and on the Come Up, which is her second work. So now this is her third novel, and also set, in that same universe of what they call, the garden here, right? Or Garden Heights. So, I like how, she's building that, recurring characters, right? Characters at different stages of their life, just like you would in the canon with someone like Faulkner, who has Yoknapatafa, or Tolkien, right? So I think it's really neat for a writer to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Angie Thomas herself, like we had talked about in her in our first look at her work, she grew up as a teen rapper, according to the jacket here, and got an MFA, a BFA in creative writing. Born and raised in Mississippi. She's active on social media as well. And this is also available as an audiobook. So, we've talked about some of the available audiobooks that are kind of unique. But, maybe we could start just kind of talking a little bit about the plot in the first couple chapters. What is it that we have here with the plot and the characters?
Okay, yeah. So this, I think you mentioned earlier, takes place in Garden Heights, which is the same neighborhood as The Hate You Give. But this time we're seeing it through Maverick's perspective, which is Star's father. So you're seeing him when he's like, I guess around the same age as Star that we see in The Hate You Give. But he's obviously dealing with a lot of different things than Star is.
Yeah, in 17 years, right? So kind of an interesting look at, that past of how things got to be where they are. But as you were saying, Richie, I think, you could still look at this novel in isolation and maybe just give a little context for the characters. Because of course, like you're saying, right, teaching is limited, and limited in both time and second, and what kind of novels can you teach in the first place, right? A lot of times they tell you which novels to teach.
Yeah. On top of that, I mean, I remember the Hate You Give, um, grew to prominence because it was banned. And there, your discussion on the canon just now, I think it does have the tendency to upset people, because I remember there were a lot of conversations about this maybe being replacing something like To Kill a Mockingbird, which for so long had been taught in, English high school courses that, would discuss issues of prejudice and in America. And of course, the America we're living in now is very different than the one in To Kill a Mockingbird, but there are similar issues and very different issues related to race. And so this, I think, The Hate You Give was, I think, such a great replacement and fit that mode so well that it did get banned in several places for that reason, because a lot of people wanted to teach it. And so, this, I think, kind of has that same kind of blueprint where there's a lot of very educational aspects to it. And I think that, alone has so much, aspects that I think a lot of students might relate to. And again, we talked about the strength of her characters and characterizations. I feel like she captures that well, like kind of some of the struggles and maybe some of the unseen struggles that some high school students go through.
Yeah, it's very true. And I think that, it's another reason why I think this would be the perfect novel for, even like a freshman lit course. And yeah, I mean, they could even pair it, right? They could pair this one, of course, with Doug, or they could pair it, Doug one semester, this one the second semester, or if they if they are required to teach, or they really like, that classic To Kill a Mockingbird, right? They could do, like you said, a comparison contrast on race as portrayed in that novel as opposed to this one. So yeah, there's a lot of possibilities. What about the characters? So we have Maverick Carter, and here he's in high school, and he's our protagonist. But what other characters did y'all want to highlight?
There's so many. I guess King would be a good one to mention next. So in Concrete Rose, they are like best friends. They're both members of the King Lords at this point. But King actually got expelled from the high school.
And then I forgot to mention, but Maverick in Doug is Seven and Star's father. So here, he's barely a father. He's still learning the ropes. So like it's still very much a kind of I guess you could call it, a Bildungsroman in that regard, right? Because he's a boy becoming a man.
Yeah, I mean, so like not in contrast, but in addition to The Hate You Give, and we also mentioned this pre-show, it's very interesting to dive into his world, especially as a 17-year-old with these new life changes thrust upon him. Whereas in The Hate You Give, I feel like we just get a different perception of him. He's been through a lot, obviously. So I don't know if I want, no spoilers for that just yet, but it's so great here getting to see a more vulnerable Maverick and through his thoughts. And I guess mentioning the characters, right? Because King also, right? You kind of see their life paths, and as they develop. And one thing that Thomas does so well is the world around them. I think she portrays it in such a way that it kind of makes sense that it's embedded into their everyday life, worlds that they've been brought up in, or as they say, it's in their blood, and that's a world they kind of only know. So the whole fatherhood thing is kind of this thing that's thrust upon Maverick, early on, and it's interesting to see how he responds to it and his inner dialogue and the challenges he faces. And in terms of characters, to kind of go back to that, like, we're introduced to a cast of characters that are ultimately really supportive of him, like his cousin Dre, more of his family, obviously his mom, uh, and his neighbors. It's like some of the community, like it's the Wyatts, Mr. and Mrs. Wyatt, that live next door, and of course Wyatt also has a grocery store. So lots of world building here as well.
Yeah. And, you all mentioned King, and King, those of you who read The Hate You Give will recognize him as the antagonist of that one. So here again, 17 years before that, it's interesting thinking about how, like you said, right, they're kind of charting those garden paths of theirs. And so for King, being much younger than he was in that work, you can still kind of think about, what decisions is he going to make that are going to take him to that path?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you mentioned the King Lords. I mean, we learn a little bit more about them. That's the gang and how they work. And so, we put Mav and King next to each other because they're cousins, but also their fathers had big roles in the gang, right? In fact, Don was the lead, right? The crown, as they say, whereas King's father was like the right hand man, and they're both of them had their own paths as well. And I think it's very interesting mentioning on because there's a lot of mentions of like fatherhood, and ultimately we learn that. Well, I don't know. We can get into this, I guess, as we discuss it, right? But I mean, I think that's a conversation to be had, like the shadows, I guess, of their fathers, when it plays out to Mav and King and their own respective paths. But I think it's also interesting how the book starts off with them playing basketball against the bigs, because that's like the hierarchy of the gang. You got the big homies and the little homies, and then the youngins. And I think it's interesting that at the very beginning of the novel, they're getting whooped by the big homies.
Yeah, the Padawans against the Jedi Knights.
Exactly. I'm gonna call that from now on every time I see Star Wars. Qui-Gon Jinn is the big homie. to Ewan McGregor's little homie. Little homie Obi.
But yeah, you mentioned their fathers, right? So we have Big Don, Adonis, as he's called, as his name, I should say. So he's in prison, and so I think I think later on we could talk about connections, but I think it is important to kind of have characters that are, of course, diverse in terms of their race, but also diverse in terms of, their backgrounds, right? And I think just having a character learning about, why is he in prison? How is he doing in prison? And what kind of influence does he have on his family while in prison, right? Now that, prison is, of course, a form of its own form of family separation. So there is a little bit to teach as far as that goes. I think if a teacher wanted to look at, the carceral system and everything that goes with it, how does it affect Mav having his father absent, essentially, right? But I really like how, it shows that relationship, how it's strained it is because of the fact that he's in prison. At the same time, the influence that he still is able to have on Mav, even behind bars.
Yeah.
Who else we got?
What about the big homies, Vanessa? Who are some of the big homies we're introduced to early on?
Sean is one of them. Dre, I think, is another one, who is Mav's cousin. I think there's another one, right? There's like two more.
Yeah, the loudmouth, big mouth.
Yeah, Peanut.
Peanut. Yeah,
right?
P-nut.
Mm-hmm. Is there another one?
I mean, there's more. Like, there are other friends that Mav's like contemporaries, Rico and Junie as well. And there's like some youngins, as they like to say, like the middle schoolers and stuff. But
yeah,
essentially it, right? And of course the OGs, the mentors, the ones who kind of advise, but we don't.
Yeah. What about the woman in this story?
So there's Aisha and Lisa, who are both characters in The Hate You Give as well. Lisa is obviously Star's mom, and then Aisha is Seven and Kenya's mom in The Hate You Give.
Yeah, and I think for Mav, kind of looking at again, like I think even if you haven't read Hate You Give, you can clearly see how his relationship develops with Lisa, and to some degree, I guess you could say Aisha, and part of I think that the big issues here is like, how is it that being in a gang, affects you, right? And so kind of looking at like the intricacies of, there's always this kind of stereotype of gang violence, and I think what Angie has been trying to do since Doug is like show how there are traps, right? And how characters try to get out of him. Mav mentions like there's only two ways essentially of doing that. But the role that King has, can't be understated here, in how he's slowly but surely kind of trying to, pull the strings, right? Behind the scenes and in front as well, of, trying to, there's that kind of, machismo, right, that we see embodied with him and with King, and that certainly kind of is reified in the sequel, or the original. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big running themes, you mentioned machismo, but I guess in terms of like masculinity, what are characteristics, maybe both positive and toxic elements of masculinity? And that's something that's very that comes up very, very often throughout the book, is the question of like, you hear the phrase man up, and what that means, because for Mav, he knows that he has to quote unquote man up, but I think he's trying to figure out what that actually means. And he gets different answers from all the people around him in his community, and I think that's worth exploring in these upcoming episodes.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, but that's a really good point. Because man up in the eyes of King, it means go exact vengeance on this person who killed one of your gang members.
Of your own, yeah.
But man up, as seen in, other supporting characters like Mr. Wyatt, the shop owner, to some extent, you could say his dad, and his mom, of course, is, be a good dad, right? And of course, it shouldn't be any surprise, since of course he is a dad and Hate You Give, so he's got seven, right? And seven is his kid and Aisha's. But he's doing this as a single dad, and I think it's important, from a literature perspective, that we have more single dads in books. I don't think I think this might be the first, actually, now that I think about it, from the ones we've covered. So I mentioned, Mr. Wyatt. And to me, he's one of my favorite characters in the novel. And like you said, Vanessa, right, there's a lot of characters. And so maybe we each could share our own favorite. But for me, it is Mr. Wyatt, I would say. And, he's very old school, and he gives him that opportunity that kind of reminds me of, A.M.P. by John Updike, just a teenager working at a store, but there's going to be lines drawn where, you still have to you learn responsibility. And he's kind of like that, Yoda type character, right? Because he's got these words of wisdom, maybe a little bit like beating a dead horse to some degree, right? But I think it's good to have that kind of character in a novel that can offer a positive role model for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so important.
Even if at first, like, he's just disparaged, right, as like being, too square or whatever.
Yeah, of course, Mav is going to see it like that too.
What about yours?
What about you, Vanessa? Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Favorite characters? I think I want to say Dre. The influence that he has on Mav it's something that I feel like he really needs. Like, even like throughout the novel. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But like, just like how he inspires him to be, I guess, like a really good father for his kids. And how he really pushes him to like be the best version of himself, and like also not get caught up in like he also helps him relax at certain points, like kind of tells him like it's going to be okay.
Yeah. I would say I would also say Dre. I mean, Wyatt, I think, is also like he Maverick. These are, and I like him because they're these kind of positive male influences in his life, because early on it's noted in his internal dialogue that Mav is just kind of lost, that he's about to be a dad and he doesn't have his dad, and it's a little overwhelming for him, but he gets a lot of help, and especially from his mom. But I mentioned the Wyatts. Mrs. Wyatt is able to watch a baby seven while he's finding work with Wyatt. And of course, Wyatt, as I like the Yoda analog there, right? Just kind of dropping some garden wisdom,
planting some seeds,
pruning, if you would say,
cutting some weeds too,
pruning away. Yeah. But we can't act like we forgot about Dre.
Nice.
And he was so, he even though he's also King Lords, he made sure to protect Mav, and that was his promise to his mother, to kind of watch over him. And because of that, Mav was kind of able to like not be involved as much. Of course, he wanted to be involved, especially because of King's influence. But when Mav was thrust, when of course he becomes a father and he realizes he's the father of this baby, Dre is like there for him, and he's kind of the one who forces him to stop selling drugs. That's not the life, you know, and then
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like he's being a model for him, because he's laying low. He's not going, you know, all the friends give them a hard time for not being available and not going out. But, you know, it's just a different world and a different responsibility that some of these guys will never understand. But Dre, of course, is kind of being this figure, and he's helping him out like in a way no one else has, where he's buying the baby clothes, fresh clothes, right? Sorry, I probably said that a little too loud. Fresh clothes, like sneakers and cool stuff, some cool threads and practical things, you know, as well, like carriages, strollers. And then he's kind of like a sounding board too. You know, there's some moments where Maverick gets to be real with them, like on an emotional level he might not open up to with everyone. Might not open up to everyone, like and there's that moment where he, you know, he's a new father, and he's struggling, and he's scared, and it's something that he can share with Dre, because to a way he can relate, right? And so yeah, definitely love Dre. And it was set up too nice. I knew it, and I guess we'll get into it, but yeah. I'll digress from there for now. Sorry, there's a lot to say, but
No, yeah, and I think, you know, now that you guys talk more about him, he's a good foil to King, you know, because King will come in and say and tell Mav, okay, you should do this, or you should come with me and do that, right? And then Dre, you know, will come in and say the opposite, right? So it's really interesting again in kind of seeing Mav's development as a young teenager, I should say. And you know, he does, like you were saying, Richie, he does kind of have, you know, he's almost like a Dr. Dre in the Latin sense, that he's like a teacher to him, you know, and he's trying to teach him the how it is that he should conduct himself, how it is that, you know, he should see the world, as opposed to King, right, who offers this kind of darkness. And, you know, we know he's King, you know, with the whole King Lords, but I keep thinking of like a king snake, you know, and just this idea of someone who's going to backstab you and entices you with temptation, but you know that you're going to sell your soul in doing so. So yeah,
true. I like the way that you discuss them as foils, because I think both, like in both their conversations, both of them are fronting like this concept of real, right? Big capital R, real. Like, I'm just being real with you. And I think both are realities, but they're both different ways to approach hurdles. And because, you know, I'll admit there's some things that King says that are kind of like, well, okay, I kind of see what he's saying, but I mean, two very different approaches though between the two. And God, just being caught up in that world of violence, you know, it's just something that you can't escape sometimes. And we see that with Dre.
And so maybe, you know, that could take us a little bit into the themes of this novel. And I think one that we've been kind of discussing here is the sense of the father, you know, whether it's Mav's father, like you said, Vanessa, King's father, and how parenting, right, you know, and how the parents are, you know, have these responsibilities, of course, but there's also the living with the consequences of their actions. And so I think, you know, in that regard, I mean, it's kind of like Christmas Carol in a way, right? Because of the fact that this is a prequel, we are able to go into the future, right? And, you know, just like Scrooge, right? And so we're able to see, where is King going to end up? Where is Mav going to end up? Right. And so you have, you know, almost like a butterfly effect of decisions and revisions, whatever you want to call them, right, that Mav takes but that are largely predicated, like you all said, on Dre, on King, and his father. So there's a lot of that, right? And that kind of vicious cycle that we see with Baldwin as well in Sonny's Blues of like, are they going to break that cycle? Or are they going to continue in that history of violence that, the Garden Heights is kind of, becoming infamous for, right? With their rivalry with the Garden Disciples and the King Lords. So that to me was one of the first themes that popped up.
Yeah. Yeah, that. And then I guess the question of like, what kind of father are you going to be? Maverick is thrust into this, and he's obviously thinking about fatherhood because immediately he starts thinking about his son's name. And he's thinking about legacy. He doesn't want his son to be named after King. And he's thinking a lot about himself. So when tying into your relation about sins of the father, he's thinking about his son in relation to himself. And so he kind of names himself like after a more perfect version of himself. He wants to name him Seven Malcolm, right? Or no, sorry, Seven Maverick.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And which would ideally be like a more perfect version of himself. So it's kind of that also, trope that we see always of like the parents seeking a better life for their children. And so that's kind of what I mean. He's also thinking about now him in the realm of fatherhood and how he's going to be as a father. And it starts all with like how he's imagining his child through their name.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We're on themes now.
I guess one of the major things that I saw was like the notion of gangs, I guess. Like he kind of breaks it down in a way that like anybody would be able to understand like what's going on like in gangs. The way that there's different levels to it, there's different jobs, there's I guess different roles obviously. I think one of the more important things that's like there throughout is the way that you can't, like, once you join, like, you're in it for life, which is kind of how Maverick gets, it gets to the point where he has to join it because his dad was so far in it that like people would have been after him anyway. So like this is able to like in a sense provide him with more protection.
And I like how, just to kind of riff off that, I like how Lisa comes in as a character who can kind of slap him silly from that, right? And thinking that, no, I want to be this cool gangster teenager, what have you, right? And Lisa just kind of gives him that heart to heart, right? Of like, what are you doing, right? You're a dad. And you're still in school, etc. So yeah, I do like how she comes in as one of those real characters that you were talking about, Richie, right? What does it mean to be real?
Right, to confront the situation you're in, and yeah, I mean, yeah. So to kind of add also to Vanessa's comment about just the gang life. I mean, even if you like, because he's born into it, you can't. It's just part of him and his family and his friends too. They're all in it. Even in school, he talks about the first day of school when he goes back and he's already got this dude hating on him from the rival gang, right? This kid Ant. And they do make a point that, and I think you already alluded to that line, Jorge, where there's only two ways out. You take a fall for another member, or you get beat. And obviously, it's also made a point using an example of someone who had a way out via football scholarship, and he chose to get beat out, but it left him in a coma, and ultimately he couldn't pursue that scholarship because it left him too beat up, too broken.
Mhm.
And that's just kind of like the unfortunate part of it. And it's, I can't imagine that kind of lifestyle, kind of there's the consistent threat of violence around you. Because you see it a lot in the book, this concept of territory, of colors, and just, getting the wrong people angry. It's always one of the saddest things is, the way we are like that. And, we see Dre be a product of that kind of violence because he was just, the wrong territory. It's very enraging. And so seeing these characters in this world and trying to figure, because there's a lot of talk about college as well, right? Because Lisa wants to, is getting ready, thinking about that, and her brother Carlos, aka Carlton, aka Common, is over there, and yeah, so that's definitely relevant all throughout, like the world of violence, and as we see it through the lens of these gangs that are all prominent in the communities.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then on the flip side, like we've been saying, I think there's the that theme of parenting while young and parenting while single. That I had mentioned as a single dad, and I think that kind of overlaps, with like what you all were saying about, how this novel kind of interrogates that masculinity that, are kind of is kind of foiled, right, with Dre and King, and how I think, like I said, in the high school setting, right, talking to kids about, like they have that exercise, right, in Sabrina and Karina, where like you have to carry that baby, right, made of sand or whatever it was, flour, yeah,
Flour.
and sugar. Oh,
Sugar.
Well,
The
sugar
story
babies.
Sugar
No,
baby.
I'm thinking like in general, like it's always like, yeah, but in the
Oh,
story,
yeah,
yeah, Sabrina calls it sugar. Yeah, I
yeah,
felt
you
scolded.
guys.
yeah. Dennis is our
Fine,
resident
fine.
fact checker, so
Keep it coming. Keep it coming.
yeah. But yeah, I mean, maybe we could talk about those connections. I think it's if you do Celebrate in Karina, you can really get into that dynamic. But in this one, obviously it's fleshed out a lot more, and you could talk to kids about that, right? And how it really is, because of course they can't get a full picture of it just by carrying that sugar baby around.
Right. We talked about this pre-show as well, but I mean, teen pregnancy is a very real thing, and a lot of it comes from, well, a variety of factors, but I think the sex education in a lot of schools and school systems can be very, very lacking, and so this, as a teaching, just bringing reading in a class, I think could be very, very effective, right? And Thomas portrays so well a lot of the beauty of, obviously, like creating a life. There's some very beautiful passages of him um as a single father experiencing these moments, but also like the stress and the fear of being in charge of a fully human being, a human person, and their development, and just having to always be up. And I think there's just a lot of what you give up as a parent for your child. And it's, and when you're in high school, when you're still developing yourself as a person, it's pressure, it's stress. So I think she portrays it pretty well.
Yeah. And what other connections did y'all want to make to other works of literature or film? I noticed a lot of allusions, of course, in this book that, you know, you get a lot of 90s references, right? So those of us 90s kids will definitely enjoy that.
Yeah, I was ready to make a playlist of all the musicians. You know, a lot of the bands mentioned. Vanessa, how many did you know? Were you like making a
I think
playlist?
I've known. No, I should have. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Like when Lisa's posters, who did she mention? Like Usher,
Yeah.
and who else does she have on her wall? Remember that Mav's jealous of them.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned pop culture. I remember him watching Space Jam with Maverick watching Space Jam with Seven, and he's talking about like one of the motivational scenes, and he wants to make sure that that Seven is watching with him. And he talks about so he talks about Michael Jordan, but he like Kobe comes up a bit too, you know, and I think that's
yes.
You know, in addition to just kind of talking about the 90s, there's something very heavy about, you know, we lost Kobe in 2020, and you know, so many people looked up to him, not just as an athlete, but as kind of like a leader, as someone who was charismatic, and you know, he had his problems off the court for sure, but you know, a lot of people talk about Mamba mentality and you know what that entailed, and because of that, so many people saw him as a hero. So to read about him just starting up with the Lakers kind of hit a different way. And you know, because he, you know, they talk about Kobe a couple times, like, yeah, he's gonna win some championships, and it's just reading it in the future in 2021. You know, after his tragedy with him and his daughter, like that's, yeah, that felt a little heavy.
Yeah. Yeah, the Black Mamba philosophy is interesting to think about in relation to the, you know, Tupac's philosophy, which we get a hold of in The Hate You Give, right? And here it's kind of the in a novel that is split into 4 sections, right? We get the germination, we get the growth, we get the forget what part 3 is called. Thank you.
Dormancy.
Fact checker. And then the bud, right? And the last part. So I really like that kind of, you know, that structure I think really works out well. But yeah, I mean, just kind of a continuation of that Tupac philosophy of life.
Yeah. I mean, isn't it like, it's like the best version of yourself, which I think is, again, tying into naming his son Seven, you know, in relation to him being the best version of like him. Wow. Yeah. I'm just barely kind of making that connection of that. But yeah, he brings up Tupac too, right?
Yeah.
In terms of naming Seven, for sure, because all of the he does some numerology here, right? And when was that album released? And you know, what year was it? And what, like, and if you add them up, what do you get? 7, you know? And so I think it's really cool, like to have that kind of curiosity in life. Like that's the kind of curiosity that leads to creativity, that leads to a type of depth, spiritual depth, creative depth. And in this case, right, he's so interested in what that stuff actually means that he researches it. So he's got that intellectual curiosity, right, that we've talked about before of like, he knows things, you know, he loves his literature classes, he knows about history, he knows about Tupac's like kind of past and his relation, you know, to the Black Panthers and Asada. But in this case, he looks up what 7 means, you know, and he finds that it you know, has this spiritual aspect to it, dimension of perfection.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
I mean, and we see that again, you know, in Doug, right, with Star, you know, and what's that?
Takani,
Khalil, no spoilers here, right? But you have to wonder, where is baby Khalil, right? Um, but
Oh yeah.
yeah, I really like all that. There's a lot of kind of you could call it like fan service, right? Because those of us who are fans of Doug, and even on the come up to some degree, this is again the same universe, and so we're seeing more of the way Garden was when it was first starting up. When King was still young.
But already
Yeah,
making moves. Yeah, that's that prequel element, right? Where you see Darth Vader before he's Darth Vader, right? And all the kind of like the plays and moves he makes to get to that, to lead him on the path that gets him to that point that we see in the later work, or in some case the
right.
earlier work, right? It's always funny talking about prequels and sequels that way.
Yeah, and in a way that isn't forced, because I know that some people complain about how, Anakin came off as very melodramatic. And, I think in this novel, unlike that, Mav is genuine. He doesn't seem like he's on rails in the sense that no matter what happens, he's going to end up this way. I think it's very tenuous, and how King is like this big shadow over him, right? Um,
Mm.
what other connections did you all make?
The come up. Oh, a quick question. An aside, you
Mm-hmm.
talked about like fan service. The come up. I haven't read it, but it's about a
Right.
girl trying to start a rap career. Is that her father that they're listening to, like the CD?
Yeah. Right.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Flawless,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just making that connection because I haven't mentioned it, but you just um I had to ask, like,
Yeah.
oh, is that a connection?
Yeah.
Just because I haven't read it yet.
Well, I don't think it's her, not the father, but it's like he represents her, no? Because
Oh,
like
so he
he
makes an appearance in the
he
book.
yes, because like she raps against his son, Lawless's son,
Oh,
and then she ends up like winning, and so Lawless
Mm.
decides to represent her instead,
oh,
I
wow,
think, of the son.
cool. Oh, wow, damn. Angie Thomas is building a whole
Yeah. You should.
universe up in here. It's like
Right.
in the MCU, and like there's these references
Right.
that link up.
And you get that post credit scene too. Um, wait, Vanessa, did you have like other connections to like works of fiction or pop culture?
um can't think of anything off the top of my head other than The Hate You Give, obviously. Oh, you're right. So there's like I guess, well, okay. So Lisa's brother Carlos, um Maverick calls him Carlton because he's, I guess, very similar to Carlton in the show. I think I think partly because of like um how he's in all of Lisa's business, I guess, is a major part of it.
Yeah. And I'm scrolling through the novels we've covered, and I'm also reminded of We Cast a Shadow. Um, kind of similar, right? In that you have a kind of father-son relationship, and the difference being that in that one it's a dystopia. But I think I think, and I think Maurice has even tweeted about this, but that a lot of what happens in that novel is based on things that are happening today, right? And so thinking about you know what we had after George Floyd, right, which was so much awareness about Black Lives Matter, after the movement was kind of discounted for being stereotyped for like being too militaristic, or not, or on the other side, like co-opted, right, by commercial and corporate interests, where it kind of was kind of whitewashed in a way. I think discussing this novel within that context would be really a fruitful discussion. I think students would have a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
And that's what I was thinking of. And, with Carlos, I was also thinking of like, Black Klansmen, right? And how you have Black cops and how is it that they navigate that world as well.
Yeah, great tie-ins. Yeah, I mean, with the Black Lives Matter movement and all the protests that erupted in 2020, like, I mean, the hate you. I mean, obviously before that too, we talked a lot about when we talked the hate you give, but still relevant here.
Yeah, because one of the criticisms is like when someone says, "Well, this cop killed this person or shot this person," they'll say, "Well, what about Black on Black violence, right?" And so it's something to think about with this novel, unpacking that criticism, right, and seeing, well, what does that mean then? So I think it'd be a great discussion of like the criminal justice system, about, like you were saying, Vanessa, the gang dynamics and how the environment, right, is so restrictive for them because of those lack of opportunities. And which is why I think it's also good to kind of have a character still in school, right, where he can still be influenced by literacy sponsors, right, whether it's teachers or counselors. And, we opened this discussion by talking about our first impressions. And Vanessa, you mentioned Angie's style that you really liked. And one of the things I think that stands out to me in this one more so than in Hate You Give is like the comedy, right? There's so much, whether it's allusions to her own work or just in and of itself, right? The kind of, it's almost Seinfeldian in a way that, Maverick struggles being a dad, a lot of other, lighthearted moments, right? So this novel, I think, to some degree, unlike Hate You Give, isn't as heavy as Hate You Give because of that.
Yeah, right on.
Well, I think we can hit pause here, and next time go into maybe the first and second part. But those who are listening, so if you're in El Paso, the cool thing is that they're actually going to screen Hate You Give at the Coliseum as part of like a drive-in thing that they're doing, which is really cool. And it's also part of Black History Month in conjunction with several organizations, I think, like Young El Paso Black Leaders and others. And I think UTEP's own chapter of that. So if you're in El Paso, you might be interested in checking that out. I think, drive-ins are just a lot safer, obviously. But otherwise, we'll keep talking about, we'll dig into the first half of Angie's book.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Literally Literary, brought to you by Border Census and Power at the Pass. This episode, we discussed Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. If you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Join us on our next episode as we continue discussing the novel. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.